Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Laura Vredeveld, President of TBD Solutions, and we are very happy and very proud to host today's webinar along with the Crisis Residential Association. I want to tell you just a little bit about TBD Solutions, and then we'll get started. TBD Solutions is a behavioral health consulting, training, and research company based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Since 2011, we've had the privilege of working with providers, payers, and state administrators to answer some of healthcare's most difficult questions. Our team is made up of clinicians, data scientists, and behavioral health professionals, and we have knowledge of and experience in national best practices, recovery-oriented systems of care, and what we're here to talk about today, which is crisis services. We also really care deeply as a company about people's experience with care and their experience in the crisis continuum. So we always want to be attentive to their voices in this process. As proud supporters of the Crisis Residential Association since its founding, TBD Solutions has always believed in the power of a good behavioral health crisis system and the whole continuum of care. In 2018, we helped publish the Crisis Residential Best Practices Handbook, and we continue to support the ongoing development and sustainability of residential alternatives to inpatient care. If you want to learn more about us, we're at tbdsolutions.com. We have some free downloads, and you can find the Crisis Residential Handbook on that site. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to give you just a few tech instructions. If you're having difficulty with audio, on your right-hand panel, there's an audio tab. You can click on the audio button and change to phone number. You'll receive a custom call-in number and a PIN in case your computer audio is not working. Also, we're going to have opportunity to have you ask questions throughout the webinar. So if you click on that right-hand panel, there's an opportunity to type in your questions. We'll field those questions throughout the webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's panel discussion, Travis Atkinson. Travis is employed here at TBD Solutions, and he has spent his entire career serving and advocating for people receiving behavioral health treatment. He's facilitated national discussions on best practices in crisis care. He's delivered talks on mental health policy and practice through SAMHSA and at national conferences. And he's led efforts in portfolio development and metrics with crisis providers here in Michigan. Travis is also the president of the Crisis Residential Association. CRA is a nonprofit trade association focused on sustaining and improving residential alternatives to psychiatric hospitalization. Travis also co-chairs the Crisis Service Committee for the American Association of Suicidology. And Travis is just a fantastic friend and coworker. So please welcome me in join me in welcoming Travis Atkinson.
Thank you very much, Laura. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. It's a pleasure to be here with you as we talk about some of these important aspects of crisis services, and we have a wonderful panel today of people who will be sharing their thoughts and experiences on what it means to provide crisis treatment services and the importance of providing those services in a home-like environment in residential settings. So I would like to start by getting a poll, a sense of who we have here on the call today. Our first poll should pop up here in just a second. So our question is, what answer best describes your relationship to the crisis services continuum? So go ahead and look at your screen and just put your vote in, and we will close the poll here in about 10 seconds. Okay, it looks like everyone's pretty much done voting. Now we will go ahead and share the results. So it looks like about half of the attendees today work for a behavioral health crisis provider. About a quarter work within the behavioral health crisis system, but not necessarily for a provider. And then we have the mysterious or elusive other category, which is about 20% of our audience today. So we will ask actually another question here while we're polling and rolling, we'll call it. And this has to do with your relationship to crisis residential services. So let's go ahead and take a look at that poll now as well. So this question has to do with where residential crisis services are provided, and if you're providing pure respite services or you're providing residential crisis services, what those locations are of those facilities, which will also help our panelists today as we discuss the importance of location in these services. So just a couple more seconds, we'll keep that open. All right. So looking at those results, it looks like about 63% provide residential crisis services. I'm sorry. About 63% provide residential crisis services in a home or a residential setting. About a third provide crisis services in a commercial setting. And then the pure respite services were evenly distributed between a home-like environment, such as a residential facility versus a commercial facility. So great, thank you for participating. Helps us to know a little bit more about who we all are today. So the Crisis Residential Association was formed in 2018, and it is an organization designed and existing for providers of crisis residential services as well as their constituents. So the goal here, as it says in the mission statement, is to support the operational and clinical functions of crisis residential programs around the world, rooted in the values of empathy, recovery, and continuous improvement. The association seeks to connect providers with the best ideas in behavioral health treatment to transform the way that people receive mental health care. So myself, I was formerly a crisis residential provider. I worked as a clinician, a director, a supervisor, and both in smaller settings as well as larger settings. And so I have been fortunate to be part of the process of developing this organization, and I now serve as president. We now have over 100 members, which is amazing, from 25 states. We've hosted 2 conferences, and we're really here to provide a voice to those who are providing these services. We recognize the importance of having a tribe in the work that you do. That crisis work can inherently just be very challenging, and many providers only offer one pure respite program or one crisis residential program. And so this association really provides an opportunity for networking, for advocacy, as well as for education. So I don't think that I need to explain why homes are important to people. If we think about all of the different functions that a home serves and all of the ways that it acts as a central point in our life, whether it's a place that we seek refuge in, let's say like in a storm. We get a lot of winter storms where I live here in Michigan. Or if you're sick, a lot of times you recover in your home. if you have a cold, or if you maybe have something that is preventing you from coming to work. It's also a place where nowadays a lot of people like to work from. That working from home is a perk or a benefit of a job. And so it's also the place where we spend the most vulnerable time every day, because when we're sleeping, we've kind of let our guard down. And so it's a place of refuge, it's a place of restoration. Many of these things we take for granted, especially if you have stable housing and you've had it for a long time, but we don't realize, or sometimes we forget, that in the interest of community-based care, which is an idea that we've been trying to pursue as a country since the 1960s in our mental health services, that homes really should play a large part in that, and that homes are central to community. And when people can spend the least amount of time away from their home, assuming that the home is not the source of the crisis, they might have a better opportunity to recover and feel less isolated or less alienated, or less coerced into whatever other treatment that they're experiencing. So I want to dive in here a little bit into the history of crisis residential treatment. Crisis residential services really started with this man who's pictured here. His name is Loren Mosier. Loren was a psychiatrist, and he worked for the National Institute of Mental Health. And in the 1970s, he facilitated an experiment in the Bay Area where individuals would either be referred to an inpatient psychiatric hospital or to a home that was staffed by basically people who were empathic. So Mosier didn't even necessarily want to hire people who already had experience in the mental health system, because he was worried that their views or their judgments might affect the treatment that people would receive. Now, what's interesting is that these people were experiencing first episode psychosis. And many of us think of psychosis or schizophrenia and say, wow, that's a disease that you really can't do a lot about. You can manage it, but recovery is bleak. And what he found in the 2-year outcomes of receiving treatment in those two different places was that the readmission rates and the readmission rates were lower and the outcomes were better in this home called Soteria than they were in the psychiatric hospital, which is interesting because he only used medications to provide treatment for people in about 8 to 12% of the cases. So Mosier, after that study, subsequently moves to the East Coast, starts a home in DC called Crossing Place, which is actually a CRA member now, and starts to give birth to more of the crisis residential model that we're familiar with today. So I might have mentioned this before, but we now have over 700 crisis residential programs in the United States. We estimate that there's about 50 to 75 peer respite programs in the US as well. And this model has also taken shape in other parts of the world. So if we think about the ideal crisis continuum, and we think about what services a community really needs in order to be best serving the people who are in crisis, we think it really looks like this. It starts with a crisis call center. So instead of people calling 911 every time they have a psychiatric emergency, it's having a suicide hotline or a place where trained professionals can provide empathy and support over the phone. The second is a mobile crisis team that can meet people out in the community, oftentimes with the assistance of trained CIT officers, to divert people from going to the emergency room or the psychiatric hospital if they don't absolutely need to go there. So then we also have the emergence of this model called a CSU or a PES, a Psychiatric Emergency Services Facility, which will sometimes divert people from the emergency department and just focus on psychiatric issues with the intent of treating them within 23 hours or 24 hours. But there's two other parts of this continuum that are very important, and we'll be discussing those today. And those are crisis residential programs and peer respite programs. So many of you, I imagine, have heard of these models before, but if you haven't, crisis residential services generally across the country exist in size between 6 and 16 beds. Most of these facilities are unlocked. There are a few states that don't have an unlocked option for people who are in a psychiatric crisis or a mental health emergency. The average length of stay, depending on what state you're in, can range from 3 to 7 days to 14 to 28 days. And these services go by many different names. So if crisis residential doesn't resonate with you, or it's not a phrase that's used in your state, perhaps you hear the phrase crisis stabilization unit or facility-based crisis, which is what's used in North Carolina, or residential treatment facility, which is used in Wisconsin, or extended observation unit. And then the peer respite model often happens, it's more likely to happen in a home, in a physical home in a residential neighborhood. But these facilities are generally smaller, 2 to 6 beds, always unlocked, with a 1 to 2 week length of stay. And the major differentiation, I would say, with peer respite compared to a crisis residential home is that peer respites are staffed and operated by people with psychiatric histories or who have experienced trauma and or extreme states. So experts of peer respite programs will say the more peers are involved, the more it is true to a peer respite type model. And that goes from the top down. So that means the ownership of the organization is likely has lived experience, or the supervisors have lived experience. So there are some adjusted models that some people have implemented, but that's what it looks like, is a very heavy reliance on peers and a non-reliance on the medical aspects. What's wonderful about these services is that there is so much research dating back to the 1970s for the efficacy of these programs. So what the research tells us is that crisis residential programs can have equal or better outcomes than their psychiatric hospital counterparts. They also have equal or better client satisfaction, and they generally happen at about 50 to 60% of the cost of an inpatient stay. And these programs are used as both as a diversion from psychiatric hospitalization, as well as a step down from hospitalization. But one of the challenges that we experience is what the research does not say. And what the research doesn't tell us is what exactly the secret sauce is to residential crisis services as it pertains to the home-like environment component of those services. Is it the paint colors? Is it the staff training? Is it the location? There's crisis residential programs, for example, in San Diego, which is where my brother happens to live, and I've visited programs in California and in Michigan. And I imagine that the California programs just might have a leg up on the Michigan programs, especially at this time of the year, and when it comes to maybe feeling better or feeling a little bit more optimistic. Is it the furniture? You know, many states in their guidelines for licensing of programs say every room has to have a chair and a nightstand and a desk. But we also know that compliance doesn't mean quality, and that those are functions that they're trying to say at the bare minimum these programs need to have. But what about the quality? Do those amenities, or does that furniture have to be of a certain type or create a certain feel in order to affect treatment and affect change? And then the last I would say is agency and engagement. Is that part of the secret sauce to these programs? Is when you are in a home-like environment, do you feel more at home, and do you feel like you have more choice than you do in a more restrictive setting? So the last thing I want to bring up before we introduce our panelists is the trends that we're seeing in residential crisis treatment. The first is co-located services. So many communities are starting to combine their crisis call centers, their mobile crisis team locations, their crisis stabilization units, and or their crisis residential programs into one facility or one campus. And the idea there is you're creating kind of a no wrong door approach, but you're also improving care coordination by having all of the providers talking to each other. And sometimes if they're from the same organization, that can be even better. but those services generally have to be convened or be developed within the same building. And oftentimes that building doesn't look like a Cape Cod home in a neighborhood down the street from yours. But it tends to look more like a facility, more like a clinic environment. And that can be hard for providers to create a home-like environment when they're inside of an office building, or they're inside of a setting that actually doesn't look that much different than a hospital. But therefore they need to make it feel more like a hospital. The other thing that we've noticed in trends is that peer respite services are growing. While there were only 30 to 40 of these programs across the country just a few years ago, we're now getting a sense that there may be closer to 50 to 75. And states like Ohio are bringing in more of these services. Some advocates in places like here in Michigan are considering what it would look like to have peer services. And that's really important. It's really important for us to have that conversation and expand our mind and say, what if we should include emotional distress in this part of the crisis continuum? And how much can peer respite impact the utilization of emergency departments or even psychiatric hospitals? And the last thing is that the spotlight is just shining brighter, probably brighter than it ever has, on crisis services. So many initiatives have helped to raise the profile of crisis services. And as communities try to be good stewards of their dollars, to try and be conscientious of how they spend their money, but also about how their values are expressed in the services that are available and that the outcomes that are achieved, they care more about crisis services. And that's really good for us. And that's why we really think that this conversation here today is really important. So what does it all mean, in the words of Austin Powers? What do we do with all this information, and how do we make sense of it, especially if, despite the research focusing on some of these aspects, there's still some questions left to be answered? And what if it's more cost effective to have a building with co-located services, but it's better for the client or the person receiving services to get them in a home? Then what do we do? So those are some of the questions that we are going to unpack today as we talk through this panel. So I am going to go ahead and start our introductions of our panelists. And panelists, feel free to start your video as we have that on the screen. So I will start with Jamie Brewer. Jamie is a clinical senior manager at Community Reach Center in Westminster, Colorado, and a board member and secretary for the Crisis Residential Association. She has been working in the behavioral health field since 2010. Jamie received her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Colorado College and her Master's in International Disaster Psychology from the University of Denver Graduate School of Professional Psychology. Jamie's passion for helping others has led her to the crisis behavioral health field. She has provided services to refugees in Denver, created a community mental health training program with the Carter Center in Liberia, Africa, provided in-home therapy services to kids and teens at risk of being removed from their home, and most recently has provided leadership at various levels for crisis and emergency behavioral health services. Jamie also serves on the board of the Crisis Residential Association. So Jamie, welcome. Steve Fields is the executive director of the Progress Foundation, and it has been since 1969. Steve has championed the development of social rehabilitation programs throughout California and the nation, pioneered acute residential alternatives to hospitalization, opened the first social model residential treatment programs for geriatric clients, and the first social model residential treatment and program for women and children. He received his BA from Harvard and a Master's of Public Administration from the University of San Francisco. A leader in local, state, and national efforts to develop and promote change in the mental health system. He was instrumental in informing the San Francisco Human Services Network, an association of over 100 nonprofit agencies. Welcome, Steve Fields. And last, Steve Michio is the CEO of Projects to Empower and Organize the Psychiatrically Labeled, or People USA, located in Poughkeepsie, New York. People USA is a peer-operated advocacy and services organization serving people throughout New York State. Steve is a person with lived experience, which has helped provide him with valuable insight in becoming one of the nation's foremost experts in establishing and managing peer-operated crisis diversion and respite services, and has assisted in the creation of crisis services in New York and across the United States and Europe. Steve is co-founder of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention Hudson Valley Chapter, and is the current executive board member of the Newark Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services, and he is also the chair of the Psychiatric Rehabilitation Association. Thank you all so much for being here. And if you could go ahead and make sure that your microphones are on so we can hear all of your answers, that would be wonderful. So here is where Steve and Jamie are located. And I would like to start, Steve Michio, with you with the first question. Could you share with us, how did your programs come to be?
How did they come to be? I got hospitalized with a psychiatric diagnosis, and I didn't like it. And that's how it originally started. I didn't know anything about the peer community, the peer world, peer services, or anything when I was first hospitalized and diagnosed. But as I did learn about it, it intrigued me and it excited me to think that I could change my local community mental health system, because it really wasn't a system that made sense to me. And I might have been kidding myself a bit, but I wasn't welcome when I first started my position at People, and the hospital wasn't the most embracing environment for me to go into and say, hey, I can help you. And so I decided, we were an advocacy organization. We are an advocacy organization. We didn't provide a lot of services, but I decided to move towards the service system because I wasn't going to just complain about it. I wanted to do something about it. So that was my goal, is to do something about it. And, you know, one of the first things we did was infuse peers into the emergency rooms in the local hospitals here in the Hudson Valley region, to greet them in a better way, a more comforting way, a more empathic way. And then the second big project I did was the Rose House, which is the diversion house, or respite houses that people call them, across the country. And that to me was just a make sense approach, to a common sense approach to serving people that didn't need that traumatic clinical intervention of a hospital emergency room or a hospital itself, and really just needed, you know, empathic, compassionate, comfortable, understanding people to listen to them, help them look at their crisis in a different way, and help them develop tools while they stayed at the house, so that they didn't have to go from that home to crisis to hospital system. So that's how it started for us, and it's grown tremendously for us since.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. Jamie, let's go to you next. What do you know about the history of your crisis programs at the Community Reach Center?
Yeah, so for a very long time, we always offered what we call a subacute treatment facility, which essentially was a hospital step-down facility. In 2014, the state of Colorado at that time designated a whole pot of money to increase crisis services as a response to the Aurora Theater shooting. So in 2014, our agency opened a crisis residential unit, a crisis respite house. We altered our emergency services to become a mobile crisis team, and then we also opened a crisis walk-in clinic. So all of those started in 2014. We have continued to operate those. However, in 2019, there were some changes in how the state wanted to operate those, and so we went in a bit of a different direction. So we currently operate a 7-bed respite program, which is located out of a house in a residential neighborhood. We then have a 16-bed, what we call stages facility, which is an unlocked facility to step down from hospitalization or to prevent hospitalization. And they do not accept anyone who's on a mental health hold. We still continue to operate what we call a behavioral health urgent care. So anybody can walk in at any time and meet with a therapist, receive an evaluation, and potentially stay for up to 23 hours for continued observation. We also have a mobile response team, which mostly does co-responder in police departments and does some community operations. And then we are in the process of changing over our crisis stabilization unit to what we're calling a hospital alternative program, which is a 10-bed, same thing as our stages facility, stepped down or prevention for hospitalization. We have multiple different co-located services. So our crisis stabilization unit, which was a 16-bed facility, used to be co-located with our walk-in center and our mobile crisis team. Due to, again, some changes that occurred, we actually moved the CSU out of that building, and we now have our detox facility co-located there instead. So our CSU became our hospital alternative program, and that is actually co-located with our medication assisted treatment team and our intensive residential treatment, which is our substance use 30-day residential program. So those are co-located together. Then our stages facility is standalone and our respite facility is standalone.
Thank you, Jamie. It sounds like you have made a lot of adaptations in a very short period of time with your crisis services to be helpful to your community. Steve Fields would love to hear your answer as well on how the Progress Foundation's crisis services came to be.
Well, I guess when I started work at Progress Foundation as a conscientious objector in the draft, with no mental health background at all, no intention of going into medical care or mental health. I was a political activist that brought me to this field. And of course, in California and around the country, but particularly in California, the deinstitutionalization movement was just beginning. It was at the dawn of this presumed public policy that was meant to move treatment from isolated state institutions into the community. And so I became a staff member in a halfway house that had just opened called Progress House. And I dropped myself into that program with all the presumption, those of us who have not experienced a mental illness phenomenon, that I could help people and read a bunch of books and get ahead of everybody and know exactly how to diagnose, help, and treat people. Within just a short period of time, humility it forced itself upon me, and I realized that I was working with meeting a group of individuals, 6 people who are living in this program, who knew more about mental health treatment, knew more about the system of care, knew more about their own lives than I could possibly presume to know. And my intellectual arrogance gave way to my curiosity about what the experience was like for individuals who now were not only experiencing the beginnings of what treatment in the community was supposed to look like, but had come from an institutional experience into that dissonance that was created by what I found to be a community system of care that didn't have a clue about what it was doing. It had no extant operating philosophy of community treatment that was separate from the institutional models and interventions that they were so trained in and familiar with. But because I had no earlier bias, I took a kind of social justice approach to what I was experiencing and became politicized about the San Francisco mental health system with all its progressive rhetoric, all its ideas, and started looking at what the lives were like of the people that were coming to Progress House, and how many of the elements of their experience were human elements, not disease diagnostic based elements. They were just basic things of alienation, of losing their peer group, of being isolated from their community, of being frankly over medicated on a level that was almost malpractice at that time. So I thought, well, you know, this residence, this small house where I was working 60, 70 hours a week, provided all of these opportunities to relate to people as just my life experience and theirs in an environment that wasn't so dissonant that the conversation was either guided by office hours, or when you had to quit talking and go to group, and when you had to get your medications, get in line for medications. It was governed by what it feels like to be in a familiar environment in a house. And I learned so much about the arc of people's experience of expressing their dissonance and their disassociation. When you see and live with people 18 hours a day, you see the whole spectrum. And I thought, well, the mental health system is missing something here. They keep focusing on this small part of people's lives, the part that's diagnosed, the part that looks like illness. And the clients and the individuals who came to live there had that focus for themselves after they'd spent years in the system. So I thought, well, I think I'll change the mental health system. And then, 2 years alternate service as a CEO, then I'd move on and take on a real task. Well, I'm still doing it. It's 50 years later, and I'm still trying to figure this thing out. But what I did know is community mental health treatment had to be not just an element in a menu. And residential services within that couldn't be a menu. It had to have a social perspective. It had to have a social justice point of view, so that we could change the system that was emerging in the 70s, that was locking in quickly to being just a community-based version of institutional treatment, not only in the environments, but also in the array of services that were being provided that were traditionally medical-based services, but also in the attitude of the people who were coming there to provide services toward the people that were coming there to receive them. So I thought, well, the problem's the hospital. As long as people go into the hospital and then come out, we have a conveyor belt that's producing people who see themselves as part of a treatment world only, and in a limited way. So I knew Lauren Mosier well. I visited Soteria in my early days. Talk about getting excited about something that the system was pretty soon going to crush, because it was too radical an idea to survive the orthodoxy of the mid-70s. But I had this goal of opening a Soteria in a public system, because Soteria was open to the criticism that was too elitist, that it was only first break individuals who presented certain symptomatology. And I thought that the lessons that Soteria were teaching us were applicable in a community, an urban environment. And that's when I developed the first crisis program for Progress Foundation, was to start to change the system by diverting people from the hospital, not as just an option in a system of care, but hopefully to become a way of transforming the system from a hospital first, a hospital only, emergency care first, to a rehabilitation and what we eventually came to call recovery model. And that's what led me to stay here and develop a continuum of care to make this work. It can't be one isolated program. It has to be a series of linked levels of care, particularly with substance use being such a big part of the profile. You have to do treatment diversion, you have to do treatment in the community and residential settings, and you have to provide long-term, affordable, decent housing that has services available to people indefinitely. And that's what our system does now in San Francisco.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all of you for answering those questions. And Steve Fields, thank you for making this awesome bridge that I didn't even know was going to happen about your involvement with Soteria, with visiting and trying to take the next step of a residential crisis evolution in how you designed your programs. Steve, we're going to stay with you on this next question, which is, what elements of a home-like setting do your programs have? So that could be something literal, like, well, it's a home, it's in a neighborhood, or it could be nuanced and have some other details. But how would you describe what those elements are like of the home-like setting in your programs?
Well, I guess it starts with, like you indicated, Travis, that the basic thing is that all but one of them is in a home. And it's an interesting anomaly in my system of care, which is a co-located CSU and a crisis residential, in our case, acute diversion. Politics and everything else came into that. But 99% of the 14 programs that we provide in San Francisco and in well, 19 programs in Napa and Sonoma counties are in houses. I like to say to people, if I told you the street they were on and you went looking for it, you shouldn't be able to find the house, and you can't. If you hang around for a while, you might see some unusual activity around an acute diversion program, like it literally, police car might drive up and drop someone off. But initially, the idea that I believed when we were looking at developing crisis programs from the old halfway house model, it really challenged me to look at what were the things that worked, not what was my ideology, what did I believe had to work. When I experienced the variety of kinds of clients that we were able to work with in that original house, and I wanted to develop a program that could divert from the hospital, what were the non-negotiable issues to make this work? I didn't want to be a grand failure. And the house to me was the most important thing. I would tell new staff who came in, it's the feeling in the house that's more important than almost any other element. When a new resident moves into the house who's coming into the program, they ought to be able to go into your living room and sit and start to calm down and feel better before any staff come in and start working on, which sometimes diminishes how calm and they may feel. And everyone can kind of relate to that who had homes that were nurturing for them. They know what it feels like to feel in a familiar environment. It didn't make sense to me that we take individuals at a moment of supreme crisis when they're at their most dissonant internally, their thought process, the things they're thinking, the things they're at, and then we put them in environments that are just as unfamiliar and just as dissonance creating as their internal sense. And how we thought that calmness, settling down, being able to start to relax was being enhanced by all of these institutional kinds of, I don't care if it's a 6-bed institution or a 48-bed institution. The point of residential services is a clinical point. You ought to be able to have your house be part of your staff, because it's part of the calmness and the familiarity that's so critical to being able to achieve what these programs are about, which is social relational connections. We need to open programs where someone who has never met you before, who comes into your house, who is frightened, who is scared, and righteously suspicious of the whole behavioral health system, wakes up in the morning and comes downstairs and sees somebody they might be willing to talk to in an environment that doesn't feel foreign to them. Because if they hold back and they don't share, then nobody can help. We can all go through the motions, the kabuki motions of a formalized helper and receiver of help relationship, but nothing changes. So when I think about the house, it looks like a house, but because the elements are there, and I would say, and I think we'll maybe get to this, to me, the most important way of telling whether you have a treatment environment that enhances communication and minimizes the disability identity of the individual and maximizes the ability is that it's a place where it's small enough. I don't believe in large, you got to have a 6, 8, 10. My ideal is 10 beds. So it's small enough where people play familiar roles all day long that aren't a part of their diagnosis. And to me, the kitchen and the dining room are the heart and soul of any good residential program. When I would travel and do consultations and people wanted me to come visit the program, we always do things between 9 and 5 in the mental health, as if mental illness likes to follow a schedule. And I would say to people, no, I want to come to dinner. I want to see what the feel is like of this house when an activity is going on that has nothing to do with mental illness or diagnosis. How much can somebody participate in the life of a small community, an intentional community, preparing a meal with their peers, getting it on the table, talking about it, and actually maybe going 2 hours outside of the formal identity of you have a mental illness and we're here to help you. And you can tell the difference, believe me. I don't care if you can go to a kind of office building institution that may be undermining some of the familiarity parts of residential, but if you see how they treat the meal time, how they honor that process, you can tell they've got the right idea about the soul or the purpose of residential treatment. I'm not hearing you, Travis.
Let's see. There we go. I apologize. Thank you for saying that. And what I said was that was beautiful. Thank you, Steve, for sharing that. Jamie, I want to go to you next with the same question. What elements of a home-like setting do your programs have?
So I'll start with our respite program because that also is run out of a house in a residential neighborhood. That is our least restrictive bed-based service, what we call it. So they have, you know, what a traditional house would have. You walk in, there's a living room with a TV, there's a dining room, there's a kitchen. And in fact, that program is only staffed 7 days a week during the day. So the residents there are on their own at night, and that's a lot of trust that we instill with them. So when we first get somebody into that house, it's a lot of just talking around, you know, we're putting our trust in you. You know, we offer the kitchen and we offer meals for them to come and join us if they would like, but it's also not restricted where people have to stay there during the day. They can come and go if they have a job interview, if they have an actual job that they are, you know, participating in, if they have appointments, they can come and go as they want. And so really the staff there provides support at a level where it's up to that individual to decide, you know, what they need and what they are going to access. We check in with them at least once a day just to say, hey, how's it going? What can we help with? You know, what do you need? But really it's a very independent way of living, and like the name suggests, it's intended to be a break from whatever is going on in their current lives and to offer them just a little bit of extra support where they need it. Our other bed-based programs, our stages, our hospital alternative program, and our former CSU are not located in houses, and they do feel a little bit more institutional. So our CSU initially was located out of an old hospital. And when we first opened, you know, it was a rush to get this program opened. And so one thing we realized was that we didn't even have, we had a bunch of rooms and we had people gathered and did groups, and separate room where the staff were, and that not conducive to helping people better and getting them to really interact with one another and take advantage of those types of things that you can get in a setting. And so when we redesigned our new unit, we created as best as we could those elements of a home that we thought would also provide for some safety. So we had a large area that was a living room space. It had couches and chairs with a TV. We had lots of games. We had hula hoops. We had yoga mats, right? We had all of these things that people could take advantage of. And the mental health techs that were on the unit, really, they were just there to hang out and engage the consumers in socialization and start games. And hey, do you want to do this puzzle, or do you want to do this craft with me? You know, kind of helping individuals to get out of their rooms and spend time together in the milieu. Our crisis stabilization unit at that time did accept individuals who were on mental health holds, so we did have to take into consideration some factors about safety. So we did not have a kitchen that people had access to. We didn't have curtains on windows. Everything in the facility was ligature free. And so I think, you know, you have to also consider what's needed for the individuals that you're serving and what are the needs of your community, because different communities have different needs. And so we really were filling that vacancy in our community of this individual doesn't need to go to a locked facility. This individual can still, you know, have their own clothes. This individual can still shower on their own. You know, those important things. They do still have some freedom. However, they're on a mental health hold, and so they can't leave the facility, and we do have to ensure that there are those measures that are being built into place. You know, when you talk about I think, Travis, you mentioned paint, and I thought that was funny because, we remodeled another unit now that we're moving our hospital alternative program into, and just the other day I had to pick the paint colors. You wouldn't believe how difficult it is to actually pick paint colors. I was reaching out to people, what do you think? Do you have any suggestions? And people were like, well, don't pick jail green. That's a bad color. And don't pick hospital blue because that's a bad color. I was like, okay, so greens and blues, maybe those are out. What color is the right color that's going to be relaxing and provide that home-like environment without perhaps triggering these other memories of other facilities that people have been in. So I hope I picked the right ones. I don't know. We'll find out.
We'll find out based on your satisfaction scores.
Exactly. But when we were developing that unit, again, it was a real focus on how do we create that living room type space that individuals can hang out with. And even though we didn't have a whole lot of choice to be able to construct a real home, we wanted to take advantage of what that building offered. So we have a mini gym in that building. So we have time for, our residents to go down and use the gym, even though they can't leave the building necessarily. So we're just trying to build in those elements. We're creating a sensory room, right? So individuals can go in there and use the rocking chairs and have dim lights if they want it, or use other sensory tools if they want it.
Yep.
At our Stages facility, we made sure to build kind of like a large ranch home is kind of how we envisioned it, right? So again, that living room space with an area where staff are sitting available and they can see everything that's going on. They have their washers and dryers up front where consumers or residents could come and access those and really be able to use those as needed. But there's still a lot of safety features built in. So while there is a kitchen there, it's the staff that still prepare the meals and then serve it in the dining room for everybody. There's a nice, lovely outdoor green space that they can step outside into for smoke breaks or to catch some fresh air. There's lots of really open windows, right? So people are getting that air and feel to it. And having single rooms, I think, is another important consideration. In one of our facilities, it's just not possible to have single rooms because we need to have enough beds to make that program effective and to be able to run it. And so where we can, we try and build in some single rooms so that individuals have that option if needed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jamie. Steve Michio, same question to you. What elements of your peer respite programs have components of a home-like setting?
So when I first designed it, and as I grew to understand what I was doing more, because there was no book that I could go to when I was creating the respite, I used Soteria philosophy and values and things, and I used some of our local peer run values and things to run it. But there was no policy and procedure around it. So I did want to make sure that it was a very comfortable environment to go into. And this is all before the trauma-informed language started coming out from people. But I knew that it was more of what happens to people, not what's wrong with people, and through my own experience. And so I wanted to make sure that people felt safe when they came to the house. And I designed it based on some bed and breakfasts that I would go to and observe and see how they were designed. And that's basically what it was. We even had one of our houses, we have 4 houses, and one of them was actually registered as a bed and breakfast. And that's a great thing until you get on a bed and breakfast registry and people start making arrangements to stay in the place. So we learned, not to advertise it as one. But a comfortable environment, as Steve was saying, and as Jamie's saying, it's really got to be trauma informed. So we're always asking our guests, do you feel safe here? What can we do to make it, safer for you? But overall, the everyone that comes to the house, houses love them and are very comfortable. But I also, infused it with professional art equipment and professional music equipment and things that would help people kind of distract from their symptoms and the crises that they came in with and things, and show us their talents and have drum circles and things that were healthy, in the house. And Steve, you're so right about the food. The food is so important. The cooking, the family environment, the building the friendships. These, respites are more than just a stay. Respites are building relationship and keeping relationship when people leave. And I don't mean that it's my organization that wants to marry ourselves to the people we serve, but we do want to help them get to a better place, and not, not use that psychiatric emergency mentality of symptom management, but go beyond it into a more of a wellness focus for themselves. So the environments for us are crucial. What I didn't mention is that we also opened one of the first crisis stabilization centers in partnership with county government and other providers in the Northeast, and we've been operating that in the same way, where we infuse that philosophy into it. The only difference is that it's not as home-like as you want it to be, but we are moving towards a better environment in that arena as well. And that's only a 24-hour stay for people. But for the respites themselves, they're hard to leave, because they are that comfortable and that warm and that trusting. But we do move people out, and we stay with them if they want to stay with us, and we work with them as long as they need to going forward.
Steve, I think you bring up something really important in this, which is that a lot of times in crisis services or responding to emotional distress, we focus on what's wrong with people. We make their condition, their presenting issues, the entire focal point, and it just comes with almost like kind of a cloud with it of like, hey, like, not, you're here because you met these criteria, and we're going to keep working on those symptoms, or you not meeting that criteria anymore. And when you don't, then you'll discharge because you're not bad anymore. But what I hear from you when you talk about bringing in like professional art and music equipment is that you're celebrating the beauty of the people who are coming through your doors. And you're not just saying, what's missing from you, but also like what makes you whole, and who are you, and what beauty can you bring into this home. It feels like a very honoring experience, a very human experience to say, that would be very short-sighted of us to just focus on whatever's brought you in here. I think of Patch Adams sometimes, and kind of like as I watched that movie, like the way that he had everybody contributing, and like just because you had a broken arm doesn't mean you couldn't talk to someone else and be helpful and be a good listener. I really like that holistic approach to say, let's celebrate what people are. Let's get a piano in here and hear somebody that has Mozart memorized from 25 years ago, that they could fill this house with beautiful music, something like that.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing to that, because I know a lot of providers out there deal with people that are in crisis over and over and over, and they may be going to an ER or a crisis stabilization 30 times a year, and you start to see the staff roll their eyes to say, oh God, he's back again, or she's back again. And the way we approach that in our organization is that's great, they're back again, because they have learned to survive another day, and they're here another day that we can work with them. So we switched the whole paradigm to a strength-based approach to say, you're not a pain in the ass when you come here. We welcome that. And that's really important, I think, for crisis or any services to understand, is that these people that take a lot of our time in services are surviving in a different way, and we need to understand that and appreciate that in a different way. And that's how we take our whole approach in our organization here. Can't hear you.
I'm sorry. We had a question that come in that I wanted to direct your way. The question is, in the disability rights movement and often in peer support settings, connecting around identity is a core component of developing power. You reference not wanting to identify the disabled, not wanting people to identify with the disabled parts of themselves. It seems like this could be a core difference between peer delivery models and clinical ones. Do any of these clinical spaces consider the social model of disability in their approach?
Who's that for?
Anyone can take the question.
I'm going to guess Steve Fields has something to say about that.
I'm a little confused. I mean, I think what we've been describing, at least certainly what's is a social model of ability, of deficits, of coming out of communities and coming out of settings where where the trauma, as Steve referred to, is fundamentally an element of why they're either pulled into the judicial system because of their behavior and then in mental health or not. I mean, I think that in a way, to me, what we've been trying to do at Progress Foundation since I've been there is to basically reframe what we see as a narrow manifestation of a phenomenon for people of what looks like and diagnosed as mental illness, to reframe it as a social justice intervention, that it's the circumstances of someone's history, their circumstance. There's just too much familiarity with the people who come through public emergency rooms and psych rooms to not notice that the last thing they have in common is their brain chemistry. The thing they have in common is coming out of communities of poverty and violence, coming out of broken homes, coming out of being kids on the street when they were 14 years old and just surviving and trying to make it to the next night. And I think one of the things that informs any good crisis residential program in particular, because you're seeing somebody who may be touching the system for the first time, is that the least relevant piece of information for us is their medical psychiatric diagnosis. It doesn't tell us what to do to get connection with that person the next day. And what does connect is this process of which this may be a field a little of the question, but the thing that's hardest to teach my staff and to work with, and we have a diverse staff still. I mean, we hired still hire high school dropouts, because the empathy that Steve mentions that has to be there is critical, is to teach patience and to teach listening and to teach just sitting with people. One of the things Lauren Mosher used to say, and I took it from him early on, is that there used to be the term attending physician, and he used to turn that around to say it used to be our job, and certainly in psychiatry it should have been our job to sit and attend, not to have to fix somebody or do something to somebody so that they feel better. And often, if you're trying to take that rushed approach, the only thing that looks like it works is a medication, some exogenous application, so their behavior changes. And what you learn in a residence is the behavior can be contained in all kinds of different ways, by peers, by the household itself, by saying, okay, you're agitated, let's go in the kitchen and make a dessert for tonight. Let's try something like that. And to me, the whole intervention is social relation. And the things that emerge after that become the elements of putting together a survival plan for that person for what happens when they leave here. How can you be stronger when you leave here than when you came in the front door?
I really love how you frame that, Steve, because if our system doesn't have a tolerance for the rehabilitation that has to happen, the social rehabilitation, then we're much more likely to lean on medications and say, listen, this is going to be a 3-day length of stay, and if we're not seeing progress in this thing, then we're going to change a medication, or we're going to add an anti-anxiety. Versus, what if we allow the power of relationship to do its work, and to have trained professionals spend a week or maybe even 2 weeks with people, which ultimately you're still in a lower level of care than a psychiatric hospital, and you might have less need for long-term pharmaceutical interventions or pharmacological interventions, because you're learning how to relate to people again, and relationships might be part of your treatment plan or part of your solution. So I love that. We've got to move on. I'll give some people time at the end to answer questions, and we've got questions coming through the platform. So thank you for everyone that's doing that. Please keep doing that. I believe, panelists, you all did such a great job of answering this third question here about the components of creating your home-like environment when you don't always have a home. I think maybe most of you or everyone touched on this, that I'd like to skip over and go back to a poll, which will lead us into question number 4. So attendees, we are going to be pulling up our last poll of the day, and we'll launch that right now. So the question has to do with the biggest challenges that are being faced by crisis programs in your community. And so we have a couple options up there. I'll give people just a few moments to answer this question. Okay, about 3 more seconds. Make this dramatic. 3, 2, 1. Oh, we still got votes coming in. I don't know. I hate to shut it down. All right, we're going to close it. All right, so here are the results. 61% of people said that there's a shortage of quality behavioral health staff, that is the biggest challenge facing these crisis programs. 27% said lack of support from community partners, which I want to dive into a little bit. 10% said lack of direction on effective treatment, and then 2% said NIMBYism. And I'm going to add a little bonus question to our discussion to get into NIMBYism here at the end. But let's get to question 4. And Steve Michio, I'd like to start with you on this. How do you create a home-like environment despite being located in a non-home setting like a clinic or multi-purpose building? And so I want to frame that question by saying sometimes people get their own ideas about what model should be used, or they want to create a hybrid. And they say, well, that might not work here, but here's what we have. Or this is the only way we can get funding, is if we have it in this building that somebody has donated to us. And Steve, you've probably seen lookalikes come up. I'm sure whether it's your work in the United States or in other countries, you've seen people that take these ideas and maybe they do run with them, and they keep fidelity, we'll say, to a peer respite model. But I'm sure you've seen others that have to compromise or make the best of a situation. What have you seen, or what advice would you give about overcoming some of those barriers to still making people feel welcome and home-ish, we'll say, if you can't control for all the factors that make for let's say, the best type of peer respite or the best type of crisis residential program?
Yeah. So yeah, I have been able to see a lot around the world, actually, and I've seen some really great ones that you walk into and you wouldn't even know it's not a house, that it looks so comfortable, living room like, and very comfortable lighting. Everything is just really nice. And then I've seen some where people have shown me where they're proud of it, and I walk in and they're showing me how they can handcuff the person to the chair, but it's a nice seat for them to sit on. And I've seen how they nail things down on the walls, and how there are no corners, and they make it safe so that people can't hurt themselves. And they're not the best, and then I gently and politely criticize it by just asking the questions of, how would you feel if your son, your daughter, or loved one would come here? Would you feel comfortable with them being here? So I take the approach of, how would it personally affect you if you were to come to this environment yourself for help? Would you like it? And would you want it to be like this? And that usually changes the perspective a little bit. And then you have to, expand on the discussion about it to say that in the respites, our experience is, when it's a comfortable environment and people feel that comfort, they're going to share different information with you. And when you come to a clinical or a very punitive environment, or something that's not as comfortable, I'm going to clam up. I'm not going to talk the way as comfortably as I would. And what we notice in the respite, people will tell us about their suicidal thoughts and about their self-injury, or about whatever it is really going that's deeper. And we'll say, did you tell your therapist about it? Well, no, I don't want to share that because. And so we'll say, well, we can help you on how to do that. So we can advocate with them. So when I work with those environments that are not as home-like and don't feel that comfortable, I talk about those scenarios and those situations on how they can be a better provider by getting better information and really working with the individual on what's important to them, rather than them thinking, I need to keep my environment safe. and they're always worried about the safety and the fear, and that drives a lot of our system. And try to really, you know, let people know, get over it, get over yourself and get over it, and work with people in a very human, one-to-one, emotional way, and build a relationship with someone. That's what's going to make it a safe environment. Expecting, you know, the expectation when I first opened the houses is people said, what if they try to kill themselves? What if they cut themselves? What if they take drugs? What if they whatever? And I said, well, what if they heal? What if they love the place? What if they want to come back because it's giving them so much? I said, that's where I come from. I don't come from the what ifs, the danger and the fear. I come from, what if we have a great time while we're running these houses and people live a better quality of life? So it's an attitude adjustment as well. So you need to work on all different aspects, but it's got to be a comfortable environment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. Steve Fields, same question to you. What is lost? You've probably seen programs that have been developed either in your county or neighboring counties or other parts of the country, but what's lost when those programs don't feel like a home?
I think one of the things that we teach staff and a lot is that it's hard to notice what's lost in the opportunity that was never present. In other words, we define ourselves in the context of a familiar relationship between the caregiving sector, the professional sector, and those coming for services. And we have a sense in our world of defining what success looks like or doesn't look like. And then it can lead to cynicism. It can lead to a lowered sense of commitment and get burned by having, as Steve referred to, people coming back. What I teach people about when your program doesn't feel like a house is what's gone is the opportunity to connect that occurs by happenstance in the course of a day. I can't tell you how many times, for instance, I visited programs that have rules about when you have to be in your bed and you can't get up, and rules when you can go into the kitchen and do things, and signing in and signing out. I mean, I want to say for the people that are listening, our crisis residential programs, acute diversion, only take clients from the San Francisco General Psychiatric Emergency Room. We do not take referrals from the community. The only people coming into the environments that I'm describing are people who would have been on a 5150, on a hold in a hospital if we weren't there 24/7 to be an alternative. And the day we opened, we changed the perception that people had about who needed to be on a hold, because now an alternative was there that they were willing to accept voluntarily that could serve them just as effectively as the hospital. So it's getting across to people that these ideas of worrying about safety, Steve's dead on about that, is that we create a lack of opportunity for the people living in our programs to find out what their capabilities are, because we narrow it down with rules, regulations, and the fear that we have that something's going to go wrong and everything's going to blow up in our face. And we never notice, and neither does the client or the resident, him or herself, what chances they might have had to learn something about their capabilities that were never presented to them because we narrowed the options. So, and that to me includes the way the people who work in the program approach you. That's part of the house feel from my point of view. It's not just the environment, it's the way that people use that environment for the connection that's so central. So the tragedy of this is clients, patients, caregiving staff, professionals never notice what was lost by not having a more risk-taking, frankly, open environment that allows the individuals receiving services to meet you part way and actually take a responsibility for the house. The thing Lauren Mosier taught me about Soteria too, that he kept saying is, that was a crazy, I mean, that was a wild place. I went to that house. It was not a place that you take your board of directors if you want them to be comfortable about what you're up to. But he said the thing everyone would say is that when more responsibility and more ownership of the success of the house was given to the people living there, who after all had the biggest investment, the more they met the staff part way, that they actually started to embrace that program. They didn't want it to get into trouble. They weren't going to do things to hurt the program. And, you know, we've served 50,000 clients in the crisis acute diversion programs at San Francisco since we opened our first one. And we have never had a neighborhood incident. And these are individuals no one knew, coming from Columbus, Ohio, picked up at a bus station, brought to the emergency room, no beds in the hospital, so they diverted them to La Posada or to Schrader House. There is a power to opening up opportunity and then meeting it with appropriate staff support that is undeniable, but it's counterintuitive in so much of the mental health system because they are so risk averse.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. Jamie, you mentioned you know, adaptations that you've certainly made to your programs to kind of do the best that you can with what you have, but I'm sure you've also either run into barriers or just seen other programs that you say, wow, I'm not sure, you know, how that philosophy comes. But what's your perspective on what is lost when the program, the house, it just doesn't feel like a home?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what both Steves were saying in terms of what that home-like environment really provides. And at the same time, I think the reality is when you work within a much larger organization, you know, so I work in community mental health. We have over 600 employees. We have lots and lots of different programs. And so we're a very large organization that does many things. It can be more difficult to balance that risk aversion and that liability when you are creating a program and when you're operating a program. And so I have had many conversations similar to, you know, what these guys were saying around, we cannot live in the what ifs of, you know, what if a consumer or a resident does this? What if they do that? You know, what are the potential risks that we are seeing on this unit? You know, and I'm very much one of those individuals that says, yeah, what if they do that? They also have personal choice, and we will be there to, you know, help them pick up the pieces or to get them the medical attention that they need if something were to happen. Or, you know, we have protocols in place to keep our staff safe. And if someone wants to throw a TV across the, you know, floor, well, that really sucks, and we might have to buy a new one, and that's an expense. But you know, I'd rather have that happen than say that this person can't come and they need to go inpatient where everything is, you know, behind locked doors, because potentially their outcome is going to be better. And we're going to create an environment, I think, in the relationships that happen when you can't be in a home-like environment. It's all about the relationships. It's all about how people interact on that unit. And it's all about, you know, if the only option that we have is lunch is served from this time to this time, and if you come, you get lunch, and if you decide not to, then you don't get lunch, right? It's all about how the staff work with, you know, your residents and help them through that decision. Because again, sometimes you cannot control the restrictions that you might have, or the facility that you have, or the building that you have. So you have to really rely on the way that your staff and your residents are interacting with each other to help to create an environment that's going to be really supportive.
I'm hearing a theme between all of our panelists here today about this idea that it's worth the risk that you take in crisis programs or in peer respite programs because of the upside, that there's so much that you could do to help a person to live. And I think we're caught, honestly, in our behavioral health system right now in a risk management menagerie, where we're constantly talking about risk and liability and what if they die, what if they hurt themselves, and we don't really spend enough time talking about the disservice that we're doing to people when we restrict every one of their movements, every one of their decisions, so that they don't die on our watch, which, by the way, do we take any accountability for the fact of whether or not they lived or whether or not they truly got better and that we adhered to a philosophy of a recovery-oriented environment? So we have just about 10 minutes left in the webinar, and so I'm going to move on to some Q&A. We've had some questions come in, which is awesome. Thank you to those of you attending for sending those questions in. Just going to open them up here so I can take a look. One of the questions that came in was about workforce. It said, one of the hardest parts in working at a respite residential facility is to discharge clients back into homelessness after the 2-week stay. A few days before a client's discharge, they usually start to decompensate due to anxiety of going back to the shelter system. How do you navigate clients' anxiety and staff burnout due to challenges of the lack of resources? And I'll open it up to anyone that wants to answer.
I'll just say that's an ongoing issue. The resource piece, building incentives into the organization has been important, but it is a challenge. There's no doubt that it is a challenge, but it's something you have to address. I mean, if you want to provide the service, you have to continuously. What we do find is that many of our guests through the recovery become staff, and those are the best staff to have. And so we do provide a lot of additional training for staff. We run a lot of promotions, get them conferences, and then we have a whole benefits incentive in the organization to help with that too. Now, not everyone has that ability, but sometimes what I found is in my nonprofit here is that we have to think entrepreneurially to make sure that we're providing good service. And then once people are leaving the service, I built into it that they can stay connected with us. There's a 24-hour warm line that they can call and contact us that is staffed 24/7. And then I have mobile staff that I've included in the whole service continuum as well, where we can go and meet you in community if that's needed. So yeah, the staffing is a tremendous issue, but you have to think on both ends of the spectrum of how the relationship builds with the staff and the guests when they leave, how you keep the staff that you have well and healthy, and then what's the follow-up once people are in community.
Thank you. Another question that came in that says, there is some evidence that suggests that CIT officers are just as likely to use their firearms, force, and kill people when they respond. What is the purpose of having police involvement in crisis response at all? I imagine all three of you have some level of relationships with your local law enforcement. Steve Michio, I know you've been involved with CIT. Would anyone like to respond to that question?
I'll just quickly say, oh, go ahead, Jamie.
I actually oversee our CIT liaison here at our agency and sit on our CIT steering committee for our county. And, you know, we are constantly having discussions about there is a dynamic occurring right now across the country with, again, an issue of legality and an issue of liability with CIT. Is that the purpose of CIT was never meant for every single officer to be CIT trained, right? The purpose of CIT was for those officers that show those skills to be able to enhance those skills. However, because CIT is now viewed as this way to mitigate some liability, there are many departments that are saying across the board, we're just going to get all of our officers CIT trained. And that takes away some of that uniqueness to an individual officer who's going to be CIT trained. And I think that might be where you're seeing some of those kind of percentages and numbers come from.
I also want to add, because and there's no time for this in the webinar, but I think it's a necessary discussion. I never thought that crisis residential services could succeed without a continuum of care to back them up. And when we talk about people being discharged to a community where they end up in a shelter, well, that's a political issue with that community. And we as providers have to fight for the fact that a crisis residential, even a peer respite kind of intervention, is time limited and temporary because it's a short-term intervention. But nobody who's struggling with severe substance use disorder and a mental illness diagnosis and poverty goes from a 2-week, even a 28-day crisis program that could be, you know, like a luxury hotel into the Beirut of their system of services and be successful. And systems aren't political enough. We providers don't fight enough to say, we need transitional residential treatment. You do not get clean and sober in a crisis residential program. You get a staging for maybe a hope that I could maybe go on. But if there's no bed to go to, if there's no social models following the same kind of philosophy we've been talking about, if there's no 90-day, 6-month program to go to where you can continue to work on your recovery, and then housing that is affordable and decent, we keep pretending that we can serve people in crises over and over and over, and then we can say it's part of the nature of the disease. It's cyclical and it keeps coming back. And that is just outrageous when these communities have not demonstrated their willingness to put in place something that looks like what community mental health promised us, instead of something like just a revolving door at the acute end of the system over and over and over. That is not necessary if systems are held accountable for the continuum of care they're willing to back up their crisis services with. And that makes a huge difference.
We've got just a couple minutes left. Steve, I want to send a quick question your way that came in, which is, does the peer respite model allow people to drop in without staying overnight?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Great.
Yep.
So we had a couple other questions come in. I apologize that we're not going to be able to get to all of them today. And I don't want to overpromise, but we'll see if we can get them answered offline. Our last couple of slides here, first of all, these are our upcoming webinars that we have. And these are exclusive to CRA members. So we offer about 6 or so webinars a year exclusive to CRA. The next one is about power in numbers, adventures in crisis metrics and outcomes. So we're going to be talking about what a good metrics portfolio looks like in crisis services, how other communities are collecting this data, and also what it might look like to put together a national program where providers across the country begin to collect consistent metrics and what those implications could be. Then we'll also be talking about growing new leaders in May, handling the substance abuse crisis, as we know the high co-occurring population that comes into our doors. And then a part 2 on retaining crisis residential staff, which will build on one of the webinars that we hosted last year. If you're interested in the Crisis Residential Association and becoming a member, the CRA is open to providers and payers and behavioral health administrators and advocates of these services. There are a number of benefits, including discounts on conference registration. This year's conference will be taking place in Louisville, Kentucky in the fall. The webinars that I mentioned, networking opportunities, just a number of great additions or advantages to being a member, regardless of what level you work within your organization or what type of organization you work at. So for more information, go to crisisresidentialnetwork.com/membership. And then we wanted to share just a couple of resources available on the TBD Solutions website as free downloads. The first is the Crisis Residential Best Practices Handbook that was published in conjunction between TBD Solutions and members of what is now CRA. The second is the Alternatives to Hospitalization document that we compiled. This includes the 37 research articles that I mentioned between 1972 and 2013 that compare crisis residential programs to other higher intensive levels of care. And the last is a study that we did about a year ago on the behavioral health capacity within emergency departments and the implication on treatment at a broader system level. So I want to thank my panelists, Jamie, Steve, and Steve for being here. You have been great. Thanks for sharing your time with us. And on this last slide here, we have their contact information. So if you want to learn more about their programs, about anything that they said today on the webinar, their email addresses are listed there. So we will be ending the webinar now. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you at a future webinar. And you can also follow the Crisis Residential Association and TBD Solutions on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube. Thank you so much.